Hey guys, this video will be discussing my early thoughts on Xiao. To start off, I'd like to say that some of these calculations and statements I make are based on unreleased and unofficial information, so do take these parts of the discussion with a grain of salt. So this video aims to inform you guys on my thoughts on his kit, where he is in the current meta, what are the potential builds, opportunities, and drawbacks of Xiao. So Xiao is a polearm user from Lia. His element is anemo and in the story is considered an adepti. Looking at his base values, his base attack of 349 is amazing, the highest in the game currently, along with his ascension stat of crit rate, one of the most valued stats a character should prioritize. Now, my thoughts on this are that yes, he does have amazing base attack and crit rate. However, I feel that he's relatively balanced, even with these things going well for him. This is because of how Genshin revolves around elemental reactions and how Xiao, being an anemo character, doesn't have access to either melt or vaporize, which are the strongest reactions in the game as they multiply the damage you deal, unlike swirls where the base damage doesn't come from how much you deal, with say your initial hit, either a plunge or a normal attack. Rather, it's a set base value depending on your level, which scales up elemental mastery and enemy resistance. This leads me to my most important point. I don't see Xiao immediately overtaking Ganyu in terms of DPS. However, one can argue that Xiao is much easier to play than Ganyu, and yes, that is a very valid point. But when comparing a player with higher mechanical skill, if you let them play Ganyu and let them play Xiao, I'm more than certain Ganyu is going to have an easier time to clear certain abyss floors compared to Xiao. However, this is just an assumption. We haven't tested Xiao yet, his AoE capabilities compared to Ganyu and other single targets, so we will leave it at that. In terms of his normal attacks, he boasts a relatively decent motion values per second compared to other S tier and A tier carries. Based on the trailer footage, Xiao's charge attack doesn't seem too strong, and I predict we would only use it if it had a stun lock capability on say a Fatui agent. To explain why it's not as strong, the animation it takes is simply too long. In addition, even though his talent multipliers for his charge attack is higher by 30% at talent level 6 compared to his 6th hit on his normal attack string, we probably only want to perform our 6th hit as number 1, it has better recovery time than charge attacks, and number 2, it doesn't consume as much stamina, unlike the charge attack. For his plunge attack, at the moment, based on some calculation, it does seem like in some cases, Xiao wants to be plunge attacking during his elemental burst, or whenever he can, essentially. I'd like to note that there are 2 multipliers here that come into play. The first is low plunge, where plunging at a lower height will net smaller damage compared to a higher plunge, or high plunge, which requires a higher altitude. At the moment, there have been rumors that Xiao's plunge attack involves higher plunge multipliers, which is great news for us, but we can't confirm whether MiHoYo will nerf this before release. However, I do think it's unlikely that they will nerf this, as Xiao in the current meta would suffer heavily if this were the case. I'd also like to point out the recovery time for his plunge attack is uncertain. There have been cases where people have been testing with Xiangling, where when she plunges and there's like a small animation time where she has to like stand back up, and this wasn't the case before 1.2, and it is the case now. Well, we're yet to hear some news about this when Xiao does come out. We will now move on to his elemental skill and elemental burst. Xiao's elemental skill and burst are really what define how you play him. As you play Xiao, you will always want to maintain your energy regeneration with your elemental skill to maximize your uptime on your burst, Bane of all evils. With this elemental skill, Xiao lunges forward dealing anemo damage to opponents in his path. If we look at the trailer footage, we can see that after performing one elemental skill, he can change directions, which is an important part of using his elemental skill in your combo. We can also see that the footage before his elemental burst shows that he generates particles when he performs his E. This contrasts the downside, which was the change that didn't allow Xiao to generate energy from using his elemental skill during his burst. So that means once you pop Bane of all evils, you won't be generating energy from your elemental skill. This limits how we play around with our elemental skill, forcing us to use it outside of the duration of his elemental burst. Moreover, his elemental skill has a cooldown of 10 seconds, which means that it can be very difficult to manage your entire rotation and have enough skills for energy. Xiao's elemental burst, Bane of all evils, is Xiao's elemental burst, which greatly increases his jump height, increasing his AoE and attack damage, and converts attack damage to anemo damage, which cannot be overridden by any other element. However, there are drawbacks, which include him losing a percentage of current HP, and I repeat, current HP, the energy cost of 70 energy, and how when he leaves the battlefield, his burst ends. Going on about the 70 energy cost, Xiao does seem like he will be facing energy issues, meaning he will struggle with his burst uptime. His additional elemental skill from C1 helps a small amount, but still nowhere in terms of how much energy you actually need. It's advised you have a few energy recharge stats on Xiao. I will discuss this in a future video and aim to answer all your questions regarding energy recharge. I would say around 120% ER all the way to 180% ER is the range you could feel comfortable playing with, depending on your team composition. So going back to the discussion of his elemental burst, I'd like to point out that his burst multiplier is just a multiplier and doesn't do initial cast damage, meaning the 2-piece Noblesse Oblige won't work on him no matter how you try. This is the same case for Noelle, where although she has an initial burst damage, that's the only damage being amplified by the 2-piece Noblesse Oblige, while her defense multiplier converting to attack doesn't come into play in this discussion. There isn't much else to say rather than you want to have your burst up as much as possible for the constant increase in damage. Potential Xiao builds. Xiao's role currently, as we see it, is a main DPS. You can run him as the first option, which is to build up energy and plunge spam, or you could build him normal attack way. The recommended artifact build would be 2-piece Gladiators, 2-piece Verdescent Venerer for plunge spam, while 4-piece Gladiators or 4-piece Bolide for normal attack Xiao. I will be calculating the differences between the builds in the future, and if applicable, at what point does a specific build outdamage the other when factoring in Team DPS. I'd like to add these two builds are for a selfish main DPS, which means that Xiao will mostly be taking the screen time. We also want to build around anemo supports like Jean, who have the same element and can be Xiao's energy battery, as he seems to struggle maintaining his burst uptime. Now, for the big whales out there, you can also run Xiao in a quick swap team composition with possibly other turrets, off-screen supports, or anyone that groups together units due to how strong his C6 is. As for passives, the climbing stamina is nice to have, especially when it comes to doing your dailies. Pair that up with another anemo support in your team, the overworld roaming becomes so much easier. For the passive Conqueror of Evils, Tamer of Demons, while under the effect Bane of all evil, all damage dealt by Xiao will increase by 5% every 3 seconds up to 25% total damage. Lastly, for the passive Dissolution Aeon, Heaven Fall, the damage of subsequent elemental skills increases by 15% of up to 3 stacks. This passive can be utilized efficiently at C0 to C5 using a carefully thought out rotation. However, optimizing for this passive uptime may hurt your overall DPS, as you're trying to stay in when you can be rotating to your supports, gaining energy, and dealing additional damage. I like to add at C6, this passive becomes your bread and butter for most of your damage, and is why C6 makes Xiao an entirely different character. We will now move on to constellations. So at C1 allows for an additional elemental skill charge. In my opinion, it's great in terms of having fun and having another cast at the start of battle. But it's not the best, as over time, the value of his C1 tends to fall off, as C1 doesn't really help the cooldown timer of his skill. C1 gives you an additional 9 energy at the start of a fight minimum, and scales depending on your energy recharge level. I'll be conducting more tests and asking around other theory crafters regarding C1 when Xiao does come out, but overall, C1 is very much a luxury and isn't really needed for Xiao to function extremely well. C2, however, increases off-field energy recharge by a percentage. This means if you look at the ratio of same element particles, instead of 1.8 is to 3, we are getting 2.25 energy particles at 100% energy recharge is to 3. Although it may seem that this constellation is amazing at first glance, how other content creators have said, oh, this is game changing for Xiao. The concept of funneling energy negates this constellation entirely. Funneling energy is basically when your support casts an elemental skill, say Jean, and you quickly swap to Xiao before the particles are absorbed by Jean, making Xiao absorb the particles instead. So a TLDR of this is, it's very much a luxury constellation. It's a luxury constellation when you can't swap to Xiao and funnel immediately. And in most cases, you probably always want to funnel energy when you're eager to get your burst uptime. C3 and C5 are the standard, more multipliers and more damage, so it's always appreciated to have more stats in our elemental skill and burst, but not completely game changing as we can level that up through F2P farming. Now, C4 in my opinion is just garbage. The extra defense won't really mean anything. Just like C1 and C2, C4 is a definition of luxury. C6 is probably Xiao's biggest power spike. It also seems to make him the strongest unit in the game, surpassing Ganyu at C6, based on some rough testing we've done by other theory crafters I have come into discussion with. The raw motion values per second is extremely high, unlike most of the current cast in Genshin, and seems extremely fun to play. Overall, I'd rate this an S tier constellation, and if you were to invest in Xiao and have the financial resources to do so, C6 would be a good investment if you are capable. So TLDR of the constellations, C1 is fun and a luxury but helps at the start of the fight. C2 is a luxury and is not really required for him to function. C3 and C5 are appreciated as they increase damage. C4 is just garbage. And C6 makes him the true conqueror of all demons. I'd like to add, based on several ER percent simulations, unless you have the multiple anemo supports for Xiao, you would run into some roadblocks down the road when playing him, and at that point, I wouldn't recommend you pull for him, unless you pull for him because his animations looks cool and you really like the character. Lastly, let's proceed with how we should measure Xiao's strength. So Xiao by nature is a very selfish main DPS, meaning that although he does high damage alone in the team composition, he's doing significantly higher damage than any of his teammates, which hurts the effectiveness of your supports. This is the difference between greedy team comps and quick swap, where the damage ceiling for a quick swap or team comp with other supports is much higher than a greedy solo team composition with Xiao focused. I'd like to add, this is just a disclaimer, that of course we are going to see bigger numbers, but these numbers could hurt us when our entire team is fully invested and you're not making the most out of your 4 character slots you have. This can be seen during Xiao's Q, where swapping out ends the duration, and how it lasts for 15 seconds. It is that 15 seconds that we lose out potential energy regeneration from supports, additional damage, and more. So this is just a warning that the big numbers of other content creators put out could mislead you into thinking that he's a god tier main DPS, when in fact he is balanced and isn't really meta breaking like Ganyu. I'd estimate Xiao's power level at C0 around Deluxe. Either below or above still remains to be a question, as we need to see how he performs after release. That wraps up my thoughts on Xiao. Before you leave the video, I'd like to say a prayer to give us all good luck when the fateful day comes of Xiao's release. So, here we go. Our Yaksha, who art in Wangshu, alatus nemseos by thy name. Thy banner come, thy will be done, in Tevat as it is in Celestia. Give us this day our almond tofu, and forgive us for our waifu pulls, just as we forgive those who saved for Hu Tao. Lead us through our temptation, while conquering all that's evil. For thine are the gems, the fates, and the wishes forever and ever. Amen. Oh.